Sasquatch family is living near our cabin in Alaska, and it's getting worse. It started with silence in the woods. Then came the wood knocks, slow, deliberate, echoing through the timberline. At first, we thought it was bears. But then we found the tracks, 12 inches wide, sunk deep into the mud by the creek. Out here, 50 miles from the nearest town, there's no one else around. Just us, our dogs, and something in the forest that doesn't run when you see it. It watches. The strange odors, the twisted traps, the heavy pounding on our storage drums at night, it's all been building. And now, we're certain there's more than one. A family, testing how close they can come. So what happens when the knocking on the tree line becomes a hand on your door? It matters that you showed up today, because in every heart that still believes in wonder, compassion, and quiet strength, we find each other. I've spent the better part of my life flying bush planes across Alaska, navigating through weather that would make most pilots turn back. But after 43 years in the cockpit, Carol and I decided it was time to settle into the cabin I'd built with my own hands back in 1987. It sits about 30 miles outside of Tokitna, perched above a glacial creek that winds through a valley of black spruce like a silver ribbon. The transition from our life in Anchorage wasn't as jarring as some might expect. Carol and I had always been self-sufficient types, and the cabin had all the essentials we'd need: a reliable wood stove, solar panels for basic power, and a ham radio setup for emergencies. Our two dogs, Max and Bear, both sturdy Alaskan Malamutes, seemed more at home here than they ever did in the city. Our daily routine fell into place naturally. I'd wake before sunrise to check the generator and tend to the dogs while Carol got the wood stove going. The morning air always carried that crisp bite that made your lungs feel clean. We'd spend our days maintaining the property, fishing the creek for Arctic grayling, and checking my trap line for rabbits and the occasional marten. Carol took to keeping detailed journals of our daily life, something she'd done throughout our marriage. She documented everything from the weather patterns to the wildlife we'd spot from our wraparound porch. The porch had been my pride and joy when building the cabin elevated 6 feet off the ground. It gave us a perfect vantage point to watch the northern lights dance across the sky on clear nights. The isolation suited us just fine. Our nearest neighbor was 12 miles away by air, and the only regular visitors were the occasional bush pilots I knew from my flying days, dropping off supplies when we needed them. The forest surrounding us was dense enough that even in summer you couldn't see more than 50 yards into the tree line. Our dogs had plenty of space to run, though they rarely ventured far from the cabin. They'd been trained well enough to know the boundaries of our property, marked by the natural barrier of the creek on one side and a series of old blazed trees I'd marked years ago on the other. We settled into a comfortable rhythm those first few weeks. I'd spend mornings maintaining our equipment, checking the solar setup, cleaning my rifles, and ensuring our backup generator was in working order. Carol would tend to her small greenhouse, where she grew hardy vegetables, making the most of our short growing season. The quiet up here was different from what most people know. It's not the absence of sound, but rather a tapestry of subtle noises: wind through spruce needles, the creek's constant murmur, and the occasional call of ravens echoing across the valley. At night, the silence would deepen, broken only by the soft crackle of our wood stove and the dogs shifting on their beds near the door. We'd chosen this spot carefully all those years ago. The cabin sat on a natural rise, giving us good drainage and a clear view of approaching weather. The creek provided fresh water year-round, and the surrounding forest offered plenty of game. It was everything we dreamed of for our retirement. A place where we could live on our own terms, away from the growing chaos of the modern world. The transition from our life in Anchorage wasn't as jarring as some might expect. Carol and I had always been self-sufficient types, and the rhythm of cabin life came naturally to us. Our days fell into a comfortable pattern, checking the fish wheels at dawn, maintaining the generator, and taking care of our 3 huskies, Juno, Sitka, and Kodiak. It was during one of those early morning checks, about 2 weeks after we'd settled in, that I first noticed something odd. The creek bank, softened by recent rain, held what looked like footprints, not the round impressions left by bears, or the sharp-pointed tracks of moose. These were different. They were elongated, almost human-like, but far larger than any boot print I'd seen in my 4 decades of bush living. I'm not one for exaggeration. I'd estimate them at 15 inches, maybe 16. I knelt down to examine them closer, noting how deeply they'd sunk into the mud. Whatever made them had significant weight behind it. The stride length between prints stretched well beyond my own comfortable step. I found myself doing something I hadn't done since my early days of tracking game. I placed my own boot next to one for comparison. The difference was unsettling. Carol noticed my lingering by the creek. Everything all right with the fish wheel? She called from the cabin porch. Yeah, wheel's fine, I replied, straightening up. Just checking some tracks. Later that afternoon, while we were stacking firewood, Carol paused, her nose wrinkling slightly. Do you smell that? She asked. I stopped and took a deep breath. There was something, a heavy, musky odor that hung in the air. Not the rotting vegetation smell you get near the creek, and definitely not bear. Bears have a distinct wet dog stink when they're around. This was different, earthier, almost primitive. Probably just a moose that passed through, I said, though I wasn't convinced. Moose have their own smell, and this wasn't it. But in Alaska, you learn to rationalize the unexpected. The wilderness has its own logic, and not everything needs an immediate explanation. Carol nodded, but I could tell she wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer. She's always been more intuitive than me, picking up on subtle changes in our environment that I might miss. While I focused on the practical aspects of our life here, maintaining equipment, checking supplies, keeping our solar setup running, she noticed patterns in the small things, changes in bird songs, unusual silences, the way our dogs behaved. Speaking of the dogs, they'd been acting slightly off since we'd arrived. Nothing dramatic, just small changes in their behavior. Juno, usually the most relaxed of the 3, had taken to sleeping pressed against our bedroom door instead of in his usual spot by the wood stove. Sitka and Kodiak seemed more alert during their evening bathroom breaks, their ears constantly swiveling toward the tree line. But we were all adjusting to the change, I told myself. New sounds, new smells, new routines. It would take time for all of us to settle in properly. I'd seen it countless times during my flying days, people moving to remote locations, jumping at every unfamiliar noise until the wilderness became home. That evening, as Carol wrote in her journal, a habit she'd maintained for decades, I found myself looking out the window more often than usual, studying the way the shadows moved between the spruce trees as the sun set. The tracks by the creek nagged at my mind, but I pushed the thoughts aside. Tomorrow, they'd probably be washed away by rain or creek water, and life would go on as usual in our little corner of Alaska. That first night we heard the knocks, I was cleaning our rifles at the kitchen table. It was just past 9 o'clock, and through the windows I could see the last purple streaks of dusk fading behind the spruce trees. Carol was at her usual spot by the wood stove, writing in her journal, when the sound cut through the evening quiet. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp impacts, evenly spaced, coming from the timber about 200 yards to the northwest of our cabin. The sound had a deliberate quality to it, not the random crash of falling deadwood, but something more purposeful. Each knock carried the same intensity, like someone striking a hollow tree with a piece of hardwood. I looked up from my work, catching Carol's eye. She'd stopped writing, her pen frozen mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" she asked, though she clearly knew I had. "Probably just a branch coming down," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, another series began. Knock, 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 knock. Our 3 huskies, who'd been dozing on the porch, fell unusually quiet. Normally, they'd bark at any disturbance, bears, moose, even passing ravens, but now they were silent. Through the window, I could see Juno's ears pricked forward, his body tense. Sitka and Kodiak had moved closer to the cabin wall, their usual evening restlessness replaced by an unnatural stillness. "Dennis," Carol said quietly, closing her journal, "those aren't random sounds. Listen to the spacing." I was about to disagree when another sequence started. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, exactly like the previous pattern. The precision was undeniable. In my decades of bush living, I'd heard plenty of natural wood sounds, trees creaking. In the wind, branches snapping under snow weight, even beaver activity. This was different. "It's communicative," Carol insisted, moving to stand beside me at the window. "The patterns are too exact to be accidental." I wanted to offer a rational explanation, but the knocking continued. Now shifting to a different rhythm, 2 sharp strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes again. The sequence repeated every 45 seconds or so, moving slowly along the tree line, as if whatever was making the sound was pacing the perimeter of our clearing. The dogs remained eerily quiet. Kodiak, our most vocal husky, had pressed himself against the porch railing, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our solar-powered yard light, even when a particularly loud knock echoed through the trees. None of them made a sound, no barking, no growling, not even a whimper. "I've never seen them like this," Carol whispered, and she was right. Our dogs were bred for the bush, accustomed to all manner of wildlife. Their silence spoke volumes. For nearly an hour, we listened to the knocking as it moved through the timber. Sometimes it would fade, becoming distant enough that we had to strain to hear it, only to suddenly resume. Closer to the cabin, the pattern varied but never felt random, always structured, always deliberate. Around 10:30, the sounds finally stopped. The normal nighttime chorus of the wilderness gradually returned, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the rustle of wind through spruce needles. But our dogs remained on edge, refusing to return to their usual spots by the wood stove. Instead, they huddled together on the porch, their eyes never leaving the tree line. That night, as we prepared for bed, Carol made a point of noting the exact patterns in her journal. "Just in case," she said, though neither of us wanted to discuss what that might mean. I checked the locks twice, something I'd never felt compelled to do before, and made sure both rifles were loaded and within easy reach. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease from those knocks, while Carol was busy tending to our small greenhouse. I grabbed my rifle and GPS unit, determined to scout the perimeter of our property. I told her I was checking our trap lines, not wanting to worry her unnecessarily. The morning air was crisp, carrying that distinct Alaskan bite even in summer. As I pushed through the dense spruce forest, my boots sank into the moss-covered ground, each step releasing the earthy scent of decomposing vegetation. About half a mile from the cabin, in a small clearing I'd never paid much attention to before, something caught my eye. At first I thought it was storm damage. We get plenty of that up here. But as I drew closer, my 30 years of bush experience told me this was something else entirely. Young saplings, each about 4 inches thick, had been deliberately bent and woven together into an arch-like structure. The construction stood, roughly 12 feet tall, with smaller branches meticulously interlaced to form what looked like a crude shelter. This wasn't the work of bears or moose. The precision of the weaving, the intentional selection of similarly sized trees, it spoke of planning, of purpose. I've seen plenty of natural formations in my years of flying bush planes and living in the wilderness, but this was different. The structure had a geometric quality that nature simply doesn't produce on its own. I circled it slowly, noting how the ground around the base was worn, as if something had been moving in and out regularly. The hair on the back of my neck stood up when I noticed several of the saplings had been stripped of their bark at exactly the same height, about 8 feet up. No bear reaches that consistently. My first thought was that maybe some survivalist had set up camp in our woods. But who would build something like this and then not use it? There was no sign of fire, no trash, no human debris of any kind, just this bizarre structure standing silent in the clearing like some primitive architecture. I wanted to document it, take pictures to show Carol, but something held me back. How would she react to knowing this was out here, less than a mile from where we slept? The knocking from last night took on a new significance. Were they connected? The rational part of my mind tried to separate these events, to maintain some semblance of logical explanation. But the coincidence felt too strong to ignore. I marked the location on my GPS, but decided to keep this discovery to myself, at least for now. Carol was already unsettled by the sounds and tracks. Adding this to her worries seemed cruel. Yet as I made my way back to the cabin, the image of that structure kept replaying in my mind. Its deliberate construction, its careful placement. In that specific clearing, someone or something had chosen this spot for a reason. The question that haunted me wasn't just who built it, but why here? Why so close to our cabin? The thought that we might not be as alone out here as we'd believed gnawed at me all the way home. The calendar on our kitchen wall showed September 20th, but my mind wasn't on the changing seasons. I was out by the woodpile, mechanically swinging the axe, each chunk of spruce splitting with a satisfying crack. The rhythm of the work usually settled my thoughts, but today it just gave them more space to circle. That structure in the woods kept haunting me. I'd wake up at night thinking about those saplings, bent and woven with purpose, far too precise to be natural. The fact that I hadn't told Carol made it worse. The secret sat like a stone in my gut. Our dogs, usually eager to patrol the property's edges, had taken to huddling on the covered porch. Even now, in broad daylight, they lay pressed against the cabin wall, their eyes fixed on the tree line. Every few minutes, one would let out a low growl, though I couldn't see anything moving in the forest. Carol emerged from the smokehouse, wiping her hands on her apron. The rich scent of curing salmon followed her. We'd had a good catch this year, enough to last through winter, if we were careful. She paused, watching me work, and I could feel the weight of what remained unsaid between us. "Dennis," she called softly, "the dogs haven't touched their breakfast again." I embedded the axe in the chopping block and straightened up, my back protesting. Could be they're just getting particular in their old age. You know that's not it. She crossed her arms, her expression serious. Something's got them spooked, and I think you know what it is. The moment stretched between us. Behind her, smoke curled from the smokehouse chimney, carrying that familiar aroma of cedar and fish. But underneath it, that musky smell we'd noticed weeks ago still lingered. "I need to show you something," I finally said. "But you're not going to like it." Carol's face remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. "Is this about the knocking we've been hearing?" I grabbed my rifle from its rack by the door, standard practice for walks in the bush, though lately it felt more necessary than ever. Sort of. Found something about a quarter-mile in, past the creek bend. Been trying to make sense of it. As we walked, I told her everything. The massive tracks I'd been finding, how they seemed to circle our property, and finally, about the structure. Carol listened without interrupting, though her steps grew more deliberate as we approached the spot. When we reached the clearing, she stopped dead. The sapling structure loomed before us, even more imposing than I remembered. Dozens of young trees had been bent and woven together, creating an arch nearly 12 feet high. The precision of it was what got me. This wasn't storm damage or natural growth. This was crafted. "How long have you known about this?" Carol's voice was quiet but firm. "About a week. Didn't want to worry you until I was sure it wasn't just. What, Dennis? Bears learning architecture." She stepped closer to the structure, examining the weave pattern. "This is why we've been hearing those knocks. They're signals. Whatever made this, they're trying to communicate." A twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind us. Both our heads turned sharply, but the woods remained still. The dog's reluctance to leave the porch suddenly made perfect sense. "We're not alone." "Out here," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we?" I checked the rifle's chamber, more for comfort than necessity. "No," I admitted. "I don't think we are." The calendar on our kitchen wall showed September 20th, but my mind wasn't on the changing seasons. I was out by the woodpile, mechanically swinging the axe, each chunk of spruce splitting with a satisfying crack. The morning air had that crisp bite that meant winter wasn't far off, and I had a long list of preparations to tackle before the first real snow. Checking the trap lines was part of my daily routine. We relied on those catches to supplement our food stores, and I'd been running lines since I was old enough to walk. The closest set started about 400 yards from the cabin, following the creek where the rabbits came to drink. I noticed something was wrong before I even reached the first trap. The undergrowth was trampled in a way that spoke of heavy movement, not the delicate paths our usual game animals made. My first thought was bear. We'd had them raid our lines before. But when I got closer, what I saw stopped me cold. The steel cage trap, the same model I'd been using for 20 years, was twisted. Not just sprung or knocked aside, twisted, like someone had taken both ends and wrung it like a wet towel. The metal was warped at angles that shouldn't have been possible without tools. And even then, the force required would have been enormous. I crouched down, my breath visible in the morning air as I examined the damage. This wasn't bear work. Bears would smash or drag, but this was different. This was methodical. The trap hadn't just been destroyed, It had been deliberately disabled. The trigger mechanism was crushed. The spring assembly mangled beyond repair. Carol's words from the past few weeks echoed in my head, her certainty that we weren't alone out here, that something intelligent was watching us. I'd dismissed her concerns, falling back on my decades of bush experience, but looking at this trap, I couldn't square it with anything I knew. Bears didn't do this. Moose didn't do this. No animal I'd encountered in 40 years of flying and trapping in Alaska did this kind of damage. Moving down the line, I found 2 more traps in similar condition. Each one showed the same deliberate destruction, the metal twisted with what looked like bare-handed strength. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized the implications. Something out here had not only recognized these as traps, but had systematically gone through and disabled them all. I took out my phone and snapped several pictures, knowing Carol would want to see this. The morning silence suddenly felt heavier, more watchful. Standing there beside the ruined trap, I had the distinct sensation that I was the one being observed, studied, assessed. For the first time since we'd moved to the cabin, I found myself wishing I'd brought my rifle along for this simple morning chore. The walk back to the cabin seemed longer than usual. Every snapping twig or rustle in the brush drew my attention. I kept thinking about those twisted traps, about the kind of strength it would take to manipulate steel that way, and worse, about the intelligence behind it, the clear purpose in the destruction. I was cleaning my rifle on the porch that evening, more out of habit than necessity. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting long shadows across our clearing. Carol had just finished washing the dinner dishes. I could hear the familiar clink of plates being stacked through the screen door. The creek's constant murmur provided its usual backdrop, though lately even that familiar sound had started to feel different, as if it were masking something else. Our dogs lay pressed against each other near my feet, their ears twitching at every rustle from the tree line. "Dennis," Carol called softly from inside. "Come, look at this." Something in her tone made me set down the cleaning rod carefully. I found her at the kitchen window, her hand gripping the counter's edge. She didn't turn when I approached, just kept staring across the creek where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the spruce trees. "There," she whispered, pointing to a darker patch of shadow between 2 massive trunks. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar wall of timber we'd been looking at for months. Then something shifted, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing perfectly still, partially obscured by a spruce trunk, was a figure. Not a bear rearing up, not a moose's dark bulk. This was something else entirely. It stood upright, broader than any human I'd ever seen, its shoulders impossibly wide. Even in the failing light, I could make out the massive head set directly on those shoulders, no neck visible. What struck me most was its stillness, an unnatural, deliberate stillness that spoke of intelligence. It wasn't the nervous freezing of prey, but the calculated observation of a predator. "Don't move," I whispered to Carol, though she seemed rooted to the spot anyway, for what felt like minutes but must have been only seconds. We stood there in perfect silence, watching it watch us. The dogs had followed me inside, and I noticed they'd pressed themselves against the far wall, as far from the windows as they could get. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, observing our cabin with what I can only describe as purposeful interest. Then, with a deliberateness that sent chills down my spine, it simply stepped backward and melted into the deeper shadows of the forest. No crashing through brush, no hurried retreat, just a silent, controlled withdrawal that somehow felt more threatening than any sudden movement would have been. Carol's hand found mine, squeezing hard. "That wasn't human," she said quietly. "No." I agreed, my voice sounding strange in my ears. It wasn't. All my years of bush flying, all the wilderness experience I'd accumulated, none of it had prepared me for this moment. The cold certainty that settled over me was worse than fear. We weren't dealing with any known predator. Something intelligent was out there, something that had been watching us, learning our patterns, and had now chosen to let itself be seen. The light was nearly gone now, but neither of us moved to turn on any lamps. We stood there in the growing darkness, staring at the spot where the figure had been, while the weight of this new reality pressed down on us like a physical thing. I jolted awake at 3:15 in the morning to a sound that made my skin crawl. A deliberate, heavy pounding against our metal storage drums behind the cabin. The hollow boom echoed through the walls, too precise to be random, too forceful to be the wind. Carol was already sitting upright beside me, her hand gripping my forearm. "Dennis," she whispered, "it's been going on for 10 minutes. Another strike." Rang out, followed by a pause, then 3 rapid hits in succession. The pattern felt intentional, almost like communication. I reached for the rifle I'd started keeping by the bed, but Carol's grip tightened. "Listen," she said. "There's more than one." I held my breath, straining my ears. The main pounding continued from behind the cabin, but then I heard it, a separate series of knocks from the direction of the creek, lighter but equally rhythmic. As if in response, a third set of impacts began near the woodpile, creating a disorienting triangle of sound around our home. "They're coordinating," Carol whispered, and I couldn't argue. The precision, the timing, it wasn't random destruction. They were working together. Our dogs, usually alert at any disturbance, were pressed against the bedroom door. Instead of barking, they released low, continuous whimpers that made my chest tighten. I'd never seen them so thoroughly cowed. The pounding continued for almost an hour, shifting positions but maintaining that eerie synchronization. Sometimes the impacts would slow to single strikes every few minutes, as if testing our reaction. Other times they'd build to a crescendo that made the windows vibrate. Carol kept detailed notes in her journal, marking the time and location of each series. 3 distinct patterns, she wrote by flashlight. 3 different sizes, based on sound, family, group. When dawn finally broke, we found the storage drums dented but intact. Deep impressions in the mud showed where something massive had stood, the ground compressed by what had to be several hundred pounds of weight. But it was the spacing of these marks that troubled me most. They formed a rough circle around our cabin, as if we'd been surrounded. That morning, exhausted and on edge, we barely spoke. The dogs refused to leave the porch, even for their morning routine. They stood rigid, hackles raised, staring into the tree line as if they could see something we couldn't. Or maybe they were just waiting, like us, for night to fall again. Carol's hands shook slightly as she poured her coffee. "They're not just passing through anymore," she said quietly. "They're studying us, testing our responses." I couldn't disagree. Whatever was out there, it had moved beyond mere curiosity. The coordinated movements, the strategic positioning. It felt like we were being systematically probed for weaknesses, and I had no idea how to defend against something that could think like that. After that night of coordinated activity, I knew we needed outside help. The next morning, I called Mike Tanner, a state wildlife officer I'd known from my bush pilot days. He'd always been level-headed about unusual reports, and I figured if anyone would give us a fair hearing, it would be him. "I can be there tomorrow afternoon," he said, his tone professional but concerned. "Document everything you can until then. Photos, measurements, the works. The wait was excruciating. Carol and I spent the day photographing the dented storage drums and measuring the deep impressions in the mud. The dogs still wouldn't venture beyond the porch, which told me more than any tracks could. Mike's truck pulled up around 2 o'clock the following day. He stepped out in his official tan uniform, notepad already in hand. I'd always appreciated his methodical approach, gathering facts before forming conclusions. "Show me everything," he said, adjusting his wildlife field kit over his shoulder. "Start with the most recent." I led him to the storage drums first, pointing out the precise spacing of the dents. "These weren't random hits," I explained. "They were deliberate, coordinated from multiple positions." Mike ran his fingers over the warped metal, frowning. "Bear activity has been up this season," he offered, but I could tell he was troubled. By the pattern, we moved on to the twisted trap I'd found. Mike examined the bent steel carefully, photographing it from multiple angles. "This would take tremendous force," he admitted. "But we've seen black bears do surprising things when they're agitated." The tracks were lost. I'd preserved the clearest ones with plaster casts, something I'd learned years ago for documenting wolf signs. Mike crouched down, measuring the stride length between impressions. His professional demeanor cracked slightly as he rechecked his measurements. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, catching himself, he straightened and cleared his throat. "Officially, I have to classify this as ursine activity. Probably multiple bears, likely attracted by your food." Storage. But after he'd finished his formal report, Mike pulled me aside. His voice dropped low, eyes darting to make sure Carol couldn't hear. "Dennis, I've worked wildlife cases for 15 years. These stride lengths, they're outside any normal range. The spacing, the depth, the toe formation, none of it matches. Known species patterns." He hesitated, then added, "I can't put this in my report, but you might want to consider reinforcing your doors and windows. Whatever this is, it's showing organized behavior. That's unusual." I watched him drive away, his official explanation of aggressive bears doing nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. We were on our own now, facing something that even wildlife experts couldn't or wouldn't officially acknowledge. That evening, Carol and I sat at our kitchen table, the weight of our isolation pressing in with the darkness. The official report would provide no protection, no resources, no backup. If things escalated, we had only ourselves, our dogs, and whatever preparations we could make before nightfall. The morning air had a sharp bite to it as I stepped onto the porch, my coffee mug steaming in the pre-dawn gloom. October was creeping in, painting the birch leaves golden against the dark spruce. That's when I noticed it, a smooth oval rock about the size of a grapefruit, sitting dead center on our bottom step. It wasn't just lying there. It was balanced on its narrow end, standing upright like some kind of marker. "Carol," I called back through the screen door, keeping my voice steady. "Come, take a look at this." She came out still wrapped in her quilted robe, the dogs pressing against her legs. The moment she saw the rock, she went very still. "Dennis, that's not natural. Something placed that there." I had to agree. The positioning was too deliberate, too precise. No animal I knew would or could do this. I picked up the stone carefully. It was heavy, water-smoothed, the kind you'd find down by the creek bed. But we were a good 100 yards from the water here. That evening, Carol pulled out a fresh notebook from her desk drawer. "I'm going to start documenting everything," she said, dating the first page October 3rd. Times, sounds, patterns, all of it. She'd already filled several pages with tight, neat handwriting by the time I went to bed. "I think we're dealing with a family group," she told me over breakfast the next morning, tapping her pen against the journal. "Listen, the knocking patterns often come from different directions, but they're coordinated, and the footprints we've found vary in size." I didn't want to admit it, but her theory made an unsettling kind of sense. The thought of multiple creatures out there, working together, watching us, it made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I dug out the trail camera I'd bought last year for tracking game movements. I'd been putting off using it, partly because I wasn't sure I wanted proof of what was out there. But Carol was right. We needed to know what we were dealing with. "Where are you going to mount it?" Carol asked as I checked the batteries. "The big spruce overlooking the woodpile," I replied. "Whatever's been visiting seems interested in our supplies. Might catch them investigating." I secured the camera about 8 feet up the trunk, angled down toward the stacked cordwood. The motion sensor would trigger for anything larger than a coyote. As I climbed down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the deeper shadows of the forest. That night, Carol wrote in her journal until well past midnight, documenting every creak and rustle. The dogs stayed huddled near the wood stove, their ears pricked toward the windows. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the occasional sharp crack of wood on wood, those deliberate knocks we'd grown to dread. "Listen," Carol whispered, her pen pausing mid-sentence. "There's at least 3 different sources. One by the creek, one near the trail cam, and one back by the old mining road." She marked each location in her notebook with precise times and descriptions. I sat with her, listening to the forest's nocturnal orchestra, now hype-aware of how coordinated these sounds seemed. They weren't random, they were signals, a conversation. We couldn't understand, but could no longer ignore. I've been a bush pilot for over 30 years, and I've seen plenty of strange things in the Alaskan wilderness, but nothing prepared me for what that trail camera captured that October morning. The day started like any other. Carol had been keeping her journal religiously, documenting every knock, every strange occurrence around our cabin. That rock on the porch, perfectly balanced on its narrow end, had been the final push I needed to set up the trail camera. I'd mounted it on a spruce about 15 feet from where we'd been finding the heaviest tracks, angling it to catch anything moving through that natural corridor between the trees. When I went to check it that morning, frost had already started to dust the ground. The camera had only been up for 48 hours, and honestly, I'd expected either nothing or maybe some standard wildlife shots. The unit showed 3 triggers total. The first 2 images were what you'd expect. Branches, moving in the wind, nothing remarkable. But the 3rd frame, I still remember how my hands shook trying to focus on that tiny LCD screen. There, filling nearly the entire frame, was a face. Not a bear's face, not a moose, a face that seemed almost human, but wasn't. The image was blurry, likely because whatever it was had moved while investigating the camera, but certain features were unmistakable. The width of that face, the deep-set eyes reflecting the infrared flash, the massive brow ridge, it was like nothing I'd ever encountered in all my years in the bush. I must have stood there for a full 5 minutes, just staring at that screen. What rattled me most wasn't just the appearance, it was the intelligence behind it. This wasn't some animal randomly triggering the camera. The angle, the proximity, whatever this was had deliberately approached the device, examining it, with what I could only describe as curiosity. When I showed Carol, her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of fear, she got this look of vindication in her eyes. "They're trying to understand us," she said, studying the image, "just like we're trying to understand them. They want to be seen, Dennis. They're making a choice to let us know they're here." I wanted to dismiss her interpretation, but something about it rang true. The placement of that rock, the systematic dismantling of my traps, and now this. These weren't random acts. We were dealing with something that thought, that planned, that communicated. I copied the image to my laptop that evening, trying to enhance it, to find some rational explanation that would let me sleep easier. But the more I studied it, the more that face seemed to study me back, challenging everything I thought I knew about what lived in these woods. I've been a bush pilot for over 30 years, and I've heard plenty of strange sounds in the Alaskan wilderness. Moose calls that sound almost human, wind howling through rock formations, even the eerie chorus of wolves that makes your skin crawl. But what we started hearing in late October was different. It started on a clear night when the temperature had dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Carol and I were sitting by the wood stove, trying to ignore the constant feeling of being watched through our windows when we first heard it. A low, rhythmic muttering from the tree line, not animal, not quite human either. The sound had structure to it, like speech, but deeper, more guttural. Our dogs huddled closer to the stove, their ears pricked forward but their tails tucked. "Tight, Dennis," Carol whispered, gripping my arm. "They're talking to each other. I wanted to dismiss it, to explain it away like I had with the knocks and the tracks. But the chattering continued, moving between different points in the darkness. Sometimes it would fade, then resume from another direction, as if multiple speakers were carrying on a conversation just beyond our sight. "We need to discuss leaving," Carol said one morning, after another night of those unsettling vocalizations. She was writing in her journal again, documenting every occurrence with time and direction, at least until spring. "This is our home," I argued, though my conviction felt hollow after weeks of escalating incidents. "We can't let ourselves be driven out by noises in the dark. It's not just noises anymore, and you know it." She turned her journal toward me, pages filled with careful observations. "They're getting bolder. The sounds are closer every night. What if they're warning us? Warning us about what? That we're not welcome here anymore. That we need to go before." She left the sentence unfinished. I understood her fear. The blurred face on our trail camera had shaken me more than I cared to admit. The thought that something out there was studying us, learning our patterns, maybe even trying to communicate in its own way, it went against everything I thought I knew about these woods. "Give me a few more days," I said. "Let me think it through. We can't just abandon everything we've built here." Carol nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. That night, the chatter started earlier than usual, a deep, throaty conversation that seemed to circle our cabin. We sat in tense silence, listening to what sounded like words we couldn't quite grasp, wondering if our stubbornness would cost us more than we were willing to pay. The dogs wouldn't stop trembling, and for the first time since we'd moved here, I found myself counting the hours until dawn, wondering if Carol was right, if these increasingly bold displays were more than just territorial markers. Maybe they were messages we needed to heed before whatever was out there decided to make its point more directly. The first real snow fell in early November, blanketing our clearing in 18 inches of powder. The constant nighttime activity around our cabin gradually diminished as winter took hold. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe whatever was out there had moved to lower elevations for the season. Either way, the relative quiet gave us space to breathe, though neither Carol nor I fully relaxed. We spent most of the winter indoors, venturing out only to tend to the dogs and gather firewood. The snow showed no unusual tracks, just the familiar patterns of moose and the occasional wolf pack passing through. But Carol kept writing in her journals, filling page after page with detailed notes about the fall encounters. I'd catch her by the window sometimes, staring into the white expanse with her pen poised, as if waiting for something to emerge from the tree line. When March arrived, bringing the first hints of spring thaw, everything changed. I was checking our driveway one morning, assessing whether the melting snow would turn it into an impassable mud pit, when I saw them. Two distinct sets of tracks pressed into the softening earth, one massive, easily 18 inches long, and beside it a smaller set, perhaps 13 inches. They walked parallel to each other, heading toward the creek. "Carol," I called out, my voice catching. "You need to see this." She came out onto the porch, wrapped in her wool sweater. The moment she saw the tracks, she went back inside and returned. With her journal, "I knew it," she said, kneeling to photograph the prints with her phone. "Look at the stride length, Dennis. The smaller one is keeping pace with the larger one. They're moving together." That evening, while Carol prepared dinner, I finally asked to read her journals. She'd been keeping them since September, and as I turned through the pages, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lingering winter air. Every incident was meticulously documented. Dates, times, weather conditions, moon phases. She'd drawn diagrams showing the direction of the knocking sounds, noted patterns in their timing, and mapped locations of the twisted traps and other disturbances. One entry from October particularly caught my eye. Third night of vocal activity. Unlike previous instances, multiple sources confirmed. Larger voice initiates, smaller voice responds. Pattern suggests teaching, learning behavior, family group, hypothesis supported. Carol had seen the truth long before I was willing to admit it. These weren't random encounters. They were deliberate interactions with what appeared to be an intelligent family unit. The spring tracks only confirmed what she'd suspected all along. "Why didn't you show me these before?" I asked, looking up from the journals. "Would you have believed me?" She stirred the stew on our wood stove. "You needed to come to your own conclusions, Dennis. I just made sure we had a record of everything, in case." She paused, adding softly, "in case we needed to prove what was happening." The first week of June brought visitors we hadn't planned on hosting. Carol's sister Janet and her husband Mike from Minneapolis. They'd been pestering us about seeing our wilderness paradise for months, and we finally caved. I knew Carol was anxious about their arrival, not just because of the usual stress of hosting guests in our modest cabin, but because of everything we'd been experiencing. "We need to set some ground rules," I told them firmly as I helped unload their rental car. "No wandering off after sunset. No exceptions." Mike chuckled, hefting their cooler onto our porch. "Come on, Dennis. We're not kids at summer camp." "I mean it," I insisted, catching Carol's worried glance. "The terrain here isn't like your state parks back home. It's easy to get turned around, even for experienced folks. That evening, we gathered around the fireplace after dinner. The dogs lay unusually still by Carol's feet, their ears occasionally twitching at sounds we couldn't hear. Janet was going on about their flight into Anchorage when Carol suddenly stood up and retrieved her journal from the bookshelf. "There's something you should know about our place here," she began carefully, running her hand over the worn leather cover. "We've been experiencing some unusual activity." I watched as she opened to specific pages she'd marked, reading accounts of the knocks, the twisted traps, and the figures we'd glimpsed. Her voice remained steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she described the trail cam photo. Mike and Janet exchanged looks that I recognized all too well, the same patronizing concern I'd warned myself months ago before I'd seen too much to deny. "Carol, honey," Janet said gently, "living out here alone, it's natural to get a little imaginative. The isolation can play tricks on your mind." "We're not imagining anything," I cut in, perhaps too sharply. "We know what we've seen." Mike leaned forward, adopting what I assumed was his professional counselor tone. "Listen, I'm sure you've seen some strange things. Alaska's full of wildlife, but Bigfoot, that's quite a leap from some broken branches and weird noises." The word Bigfoot hung in the air like smoke. We'd never used that term ourselves. It felt too sensational, too tied to tabloid headlines and hoax videos. What we'd encountered deserved more respect than that. As if on cue, the first knock came. Sharp, deliberate. From the ridge behind the cabin, Janet jumped, spilling her coffee. "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, another knock responded from the opposite direction. Then another, closer to the creek. The dogs pressed themselves against Carol's legs, whining softly. "Probably just trees settling," Mike suggested, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Or woodpeckers at 10:30 at night?" Carol asked quietly, making another note in her journal. The knocks continued, forming that familiar pattern we'd come to recognize. 3 quick strikes. A pause. 2 more, moving in a circle around our property. Our guests sat in stunned silence, their earlier skepticism crumbling with each new sound. "Still think we're being imaginative?" I asked, but there was no satisfaction in being proven right. Only the familiar dread of knowing we weren't alone. Out here, and now we had 2 more people to worry about. That night with Janet and Mike marked a turning point for us. Not because anything drastically changed with our unseen watchers, but because it forced us to finally accept our situation for what it was. 5 years have passed since then, and Carol and I still live in our cabin, though we've adapted our lives in ways that would seem strange to most folks. We don't stay out after sunset anymore. It's just not worth the risk. The dogs come in before dusk, and we've installed better lighting around the property, though we're careful not to point it directly into the tree line. That feels too much like provocation. Carol keeps maintaining her journals, filling volume after volume with meticulous observations. Sometimes I catch her rereading old entries, connecting patterns I might have missed. "They're most active during the full moon," she say, "or they always go quiet 2 weeks before the first snow." She might be right. After all this time, I've learned to trust her instincts. The locals around Talkeetna have mixed reactions when our story occasionally comes up. Most just roll their eyes or blame it on cabin fever, like Janet did that first night. But every now and then, usually after a few drinks at the Fairview Inn, someone will pull me aside and whisper their own story. A hunter who found his game cache rearranged in ways no bear could manage. a trapper whose lines were systematically dismantled, a pilot who swears he saw something impossible while flying low over the spruce forest. We've had wildlife officials out here 3 more times since that first visit. They still write everything off as bears or wolves, but their explanations feel hollow against what we've witnessed. The last ranger, a younger guy, actually asked to see Carol's journals. He spent 2 hours reading them, taking notes of his own, before leaving without much comment. But he looked shaken. The knocks still come, though less frequently now. Sometimes we'll find signs they've been close to the cabin, arranged stones, broken branches placed in obvious patterns, prints in the mud that disappear into the undergrowth. It's as if they're reminding us they're still here, still watching. Carol thinks they've been studying us just as much as we've been studying them. Testing our boundaries, she says, learning our habits. She might be right about that too. The thought should probably terrify me more than it does. But after all these years, I've developed a strange sort of respect for whatever shares these woods with us. They've never tried to harm us, never crossed certain lines. It's almost like we've reached an unspoken agreement about sharing this territory. Still, there are nights when I lie awake, listening to those rhythmic knocks echo through the darkness, and I wonder, what do they make of us? Are we simply curiosities to them, or part of some longer game we can't begin to understand? Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow, with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.